On the 11th of June 1509, Catherine finally became Queen of England, as the wife of King Henry VIII. Preparations immediately began for a joint coronation, and they were crowned on the 24th of June 1509 in Westminster Abbey. It was a happy match, and Catherine was soon pregnant with her first child. On the evening of the 30th of January, she went into premature labor and gave birth to a stillborn daughter. The swelling in her stomach remained, and so the surgeons surmised she had been carrying twins. March, April and May passed by, but there was no child. It wouldn't take long for her to conceive again, and on Wednesday, the 1st of January 1511, Catherine gave birth to a healthy boy. Catherine must have been over the moon. Unfortunately, the young prince died on the 22nd of February 1511. In 1513, Henry had begun to plan a French invasion, and he left behind a pregnant Catherine as regent of England. It was a huge risk for Henry, leaving while there was no direct heir to the kingdom. The Scots immediately took Henry's absence from England as an excuse to invade. When the armies finally engaged in September, the Scottish King James IV, who also happened to be married to Catherine's sister-in-law Margaret, was killed during the battle. She proudly wrote to Henry and sent him the king's coat. Her luck was overshadowed by the loss of her third child sometime in October. In either December 1514 or January 1515, Catherine lost her fourth child. She did not give up, however, and she was pregnant again around 4 months later. At last, she would give birth to a child who would survive. The only disappointment was the gender. On the 18th of February 1516, just before dawn, Catherine gave birth to future Queen Mary I. An optimistic Henry commented, "If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, the sons would follow." Around this time, Catherine's father Ferdinand died, and the news was kept from her until her ordeal was over. The death of her father was followed by the death of her sister Maria in 1517. Catherine and Joanna were now the only surviving children of Isabella and Ferdinand. Catherine would conceive twice more, but Mary would remain their only surviving child. In June 1519, Bessie Blount gave birth to the king's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. Perhaps this made Henry realize that the problem may not be with him, but with Catherine. Soon, life would begin to change. Anne Boleyn, the woman to whom her name would be linked throughout history, made her first appearance on the international stage of the Field of the Cloth of Gold in the retinue of Queen Claude of France. Henry had also had an affair with Anne's sister Mary, and Mary's first child Catherine may have been fathered by Henry. By 1525, Henry had begun to question why his marriage had not been blessed with children, sons, and he had been confiding in Cardinal Wolsey about the doubts of his marriage. Things were soon to fall apart, and it was all due to Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Anne. Catherine would have to fight for her marriage and the right of her daughter Mary. Doubts were raised about the validity of Catherine's first marriage to Arthur. A passage from Leviticus was used to justify the validity of Catherine's marriage to Henry. "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, he has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." For Henry, having just a daughter was as good as childlessness. In June 1529, she made perhaps her most famous speech as she knelt before Henry at the Blackfriars Court. After her speech, she stood up and left the courtroom. The court was suspended for the summer, which may have been a small victory for Catherine. The question was referred back to Rome and the Pope, but the Pope was not on Henry's side, and so he needed a way around the Pope. Catherine was in a state of despair and depression, and her treatment went from bad to worse. Her health had begun to deteriorate, and she was kept from her daughter. In July 1531, Henry and Anne left on a hunting trip, and Catherine was left behind. She did not know it yet, but she would never see Henry again. Catherine tried to contact Henry, but he rebuffed all her attempts at contact. Around this time, she also saw her daughter for the very last time. Henry would never permit them to be together again. In May 1532, Catherine was ordered to move to Hatfield. Anne and Henry were probably married in secret in November 1532, upon their return from France. Catherine learned of Anne's pregnancy as she was being moved to Ampthill Castle. Finally, things began to speed up. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, fulfilled his king's expectations and pronounced that Henry's first marriage was null and void, making Anne his first legitimate wife. Catherine was no longer allowed to call herself queen and would instead be known as the Dowager Princess of Wales. Catherine never gave up the title of Queen and insisted that she be addressed as such. Even Mary defied Anne when Anne visited the household of Princess Elizabeth, who was born in September 1533. After Catherine's disobedience, her household was reduced, and she was moved to Buckden House. In March 1534, a new Act of Succession was passed, making Princess Mary illegitimate. It was Catherine's worst fear come true. Catherine was moved a final time to Kimbolton Castle, and by the end of 1535, her health was declining rapidly. She began to prepare for death, and she wrote a final letter to Henry, although there is some debate about its authenticity. Catherine died on 10th January 1536. An autopsy was performed, and all the organs were normal, except for the heart, which was black. She was buried in Peterborough Cathedral as a Princess Dowager on the 29th of January 1536.